I'm Rachel Meliotis. I'm a senior editor at O'Reilly Media, and I am here at OSCON 2013 with Tom Wheeler. Thank you for joining me. You are a senior curriculum developer at Cloudera.
That's right.
All right. So you have worked all over the place. You've worked in medical, aerospace, finance, IT consulting. Has big data sort of been following you everywhere you go?
It has. It's really been a trend that I've noticed over the past 15 years during my career. Although I'm a curriculum developer at Cloudera, so I help write the training material, my background is really in software engineering, and that's where I've done most of my work. And so 15 years ago, I was working on the early web development team for a large brokerage company. And this was during the bull market of the late 1990s. And during that time, the volume of the shares traded doubled or quadrupled, and the number of quotes that went on, that also went up by a factor of 10 or so. And so we were preparing our systems for this onslaught of data. And then a few years later, I'd moved on into the healthcare market where I was developing a system for scalable, distributed data storage and processing. And what I found is that during the 2 or 3 years that I was there, the amount of data that we were processing went up by a factor of about 400%. And then a few years later, I was working in aerospace engineering, helping to write software to find interesting patterns in some flight test data. And what I found during that time is that users have an insatiable amount of appetite for data. So I wrote a program to process 100 million records, and then they rewarded that by throwing about 5 billion records at me. So I had to re-architect certain parts of the system to be able to handle that load of data. And then they threw even more data at me. And so by the end, we were handling tens of billions of rows of data. And this is a pattern that I've seen. And it was at that point that I recognized that it's not really the code that matters, it's the data. So I was spending my life writing software to be able to process data, but 10 years from now or 20 years from now, somebody else is going to replace that software with something else because the technology will change, the time will change, but the thing that really matters, the thing that's valuable to the business is the results that my programs created. Once I recognized that, it had a pretty profound impact on my career, and I said I need to go and work for a company that is a leader in processing data. So that's what I've done.
Well, I mean, that's huge amounts of data, and I know that Hadoop is something that a lot of people use. Did you move to Cloudera, as you mentioned, to sort of master Hadoop, or was that something that sort of just happened over time?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I was working as a software engineer through most of my career. I've also done technical training because I like to learn about things, and then I like to teach other people about them because I get excited about them and I want them to know about them too. But the very act of learning something to be able to teach it to somebody else forces you to learn things that you would not otherwise have had to do. Because when you're writing software, you're solving your problem. When you're trying to learn how to explain something to somebody else, you have to anticipate all the different questions they might ask, and it forces you to learn lots of things that you otherwise wouldn't have bothered with. And so I came to Cloudera in 2011, but I'd actually started using Hadoop in 2007 or 2008.
Right.
And I first gave a presentation about it, and then I wrote an article about it, and I really got involved and experimented a lot on my own. But when I joined Cloudera, it was the experience of being able to talk to the people who wrote the software, being able to talk to the customers about the interesting things that they were doing with it, that really opened my eyes to the bigger picture about how it all works, and it's just been really exciting.
Interesting. So can you crystallize for me maybe in 1 or 2 points why someone should use Hadoop for the large-scale data storage and processing?
Sure, yeah. I think the two main reasons to use Hadoop are scale and flexibility. So if you have small amounts of data, Hadoop is not the best solution. On the other hand, if you write something to process your data using Hadoop or its related tools like Hive, Pig, Impala, or things like that, then you don't have to re-architect your system as the amount of data grows. So that's a lesson that I've learned, from my past experience. If I had written something that could handle a huge amount of data up front, it would have reduced the amount of work that I had to do later on to get it to scale, and it's inevitable that you're going to get more and more data as time goes on. The other is flexibility. It doesn't require you to know up front and make educated guesses about what your data might look like in 5 years. You don't have to define the schema, a bunch of columns and so forth about what kind of data you're storing. You can store the data, and when you need to analyze it, you can look at the data you have and figure out the best way to do that. So it gives you a lot of flexibility.
So you mentioned the fact that the data is important, and that the software that you create, 10 years down the line, someone's going to have to either use that or change. How do you sort of future-proof what you're doing? Is there a way to do that or help the next guy in line that's working with the data?
Yeah, I think you have to be clear when you're working with data. Provenance is important, so you need to know where the data came from, how it's been modified, have systems in place that allow you to track modifications and compare different data sets. It's important to work with small amounts of data to get your programs working correctly, and then you know that they're going to work with more amount of data. Then you just have to worry about scalability, and I think it's important to document what you've done so that other people know what it is they're working with. Because one thing that I've learned, when you're working with a small amount of data, there will be mistakes. When you're working with a large amount of data, there'll be a lot of mistakes. And so it's important to identify what those are and correct them early on, because it saves you a lot of work down the road.
Definitely. How would you like to see sort of the open source technology around Hadoop evolve over the next few years?
Well, I think I'm getting my wish, because Doug Cutting, who's one of the creators of Hadoop, he's the chief architect at Cloudera and also the chairperson of the Apache Software Foundation for the last few years. He said something really important at a keynote address a couple of years ago. He said that Hadoop is the kernel of a distributed operating system. And I think that's really brilliant insight, because Hadoop is something that's going to be at the core of a lot of data processing efforts. And just like the kernel of an operating system, it's important, but very few people need to know about it. So Hadoop adoption to this point has been largely the domain of really, really technical people. People that know how to write code in Java, they understand networking, they understand Linux, and there's a whole class of people that don't understand and don't particularly want to understand all those details. And so you start to have tools like Hive that allows you to do SQL-style queries on large amounts of data, and it reduces the barrier to entry. And Cloudera announced last year at a conference in New York, Strata, Impala, which allows you to do very similar things on vast amounts of data, only they're way, way faster. So it reduces the barrier to entry, because someone who's a business analyst, for example, can do queries either the same way they've been doing them with a relational database before, or by using business intelligence tools where it's graphical, and they click a few buttons and they get the result out. And they don't have to be concerned with how that data is stored, and they don't have to be concerned with a bunch of technical details of how to access it. It's something that makes it very easy to transition from the tools they've been using to the tools that scale very well.
Amazing. So I think it's going in a good direction, personally. And it's been a pleasure talking to you. So
Okay,
thank you for stopping by.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.